Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Vikas Kumar Thakur, and I am a research assistant at the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi. It is with great pleasure that I extend a warm welcome to another edition of ICS's Wednesday seminar titled Middle Powers in an Age of Geopolitical Rivalry. Middle powers lack the capability of great powers but are still ambitious. Historically, they have used their assets guided by clear norms of promoting UN Charter of Human Rights and have also played a significant role in maintaining stability in the international political structure. Today, middle powers have lost influence due to geopolitical rivalry, while new and more strategically autonomous middle powers have emerged. This presentation will examine the future role of middle powers validated through the case study of cross-strait relations. The speaker for today's session is Professor Rafiq Dosani, a senior economist at RAND and a professor at RD RAND Graduate School. His research interest focuses on Asian development, security, trade, and technology. His recent work includes research on middle powers in cross-strait conflicts, China's AI export, and the Belt and Road Initiative. Previously, he was director of Stanford University's Center for South Asia. He holds a PhD in finance from Northwestern University, an MBA from IIM Calcutta, and a BA in economics from St. Stephen's College, New Delhi. The chair for today's session is Professor Sandeep Kumar Misra. He is a professor of Korean Studies at the School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, an honorary fellow at the Institute of Chinese Studies and a distinguished fellow at the Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies. He holds a PhD in Korean Studies from JNU and has studied Korean at Yonsei and Sogang University. Professor Misra has published extensively and also features in newspapers like Korea Times, Times of India, and Indian Express. Before I hand over to the chair, I would like to ask all participants to follow a few housekeeping rules. All participants are requested to remain muted during the seminar. You may post your questions in the chat box along with your name and affiliation. Alternatively, you may use the raise your hand option during the interactive session. After the presentation, you will be called upon to unmute yourself and ask questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Vikas. I think it's my pleasure and privilege to moderate this lecture. I think we have been got informed by scholars like Dr. Rafiq Dosani. He has been working in this field for many years. And today he is going to speak about a very relevant topic, that is middle powers in the age of geopolitical rivalry. As we all know that, especially the Indo-Pacific region, we are having two big narratives, meta-narratives, you may say. One is basically, you all know, that is called Rise of China, which had been apparently become quite assertive. And especially after Xi Jinping era, 2013 onwards, there have been multiple unilateral steps by China to alter the status quo in be it South China Sea, East China Sea, Indian Ocean, or Indian border, or in this whole region. And I think that has created lots of unease in the minds of regional countries. And they have been trying to think about what could be the mechanism, what could be the response to this China's growing so-called assertiveness and revisionism. They are worried because, China, especially in economic domain, already they are the most important player in this region. Almost like last 2 years, things have slightly changed. Otherwise, China was #1 trading partner of all these countries. And through AIIB and BRI, they were looking to redraw the economic order of this region. More than anything else, China was #1 trading partner of almost every country in this region. So I think China's, in at least economic domain, they had already got very important position. In security domain also, they have been trying to do that. So this is one important trend in the Indo-Pacific region. Another important trend had been emerging, probably, I'm not very sure, but probably in response to China's rise, assertive rise, revisionism, and that is called Indo-Pacific strategy. Many important countries of the region, like India, like Japan, like Australia, like United States, even ASEAN countries, they have also formulated their Indo-Pacific. They sometimes call it strategy, sometimes they call it vision, sometimes they call it outlook, framework, whatever they say. But they also have been trying to formulate a blueprint about the future Indo-Pacific order. And in most of the cases, or rather, I will say in all the cases, even though they don't name China, but basically their response, this action is basically influenced by China's rise and assertive rise. So these are the two important trends, big trends happening in the region. Quad is there. I'm not saying that all Indo-Pacific strategies of different countries, they are same. They are work in progress. They have lots of nuanceical here and there differences. But this is the big two narratives, two big trends in Indo-Pacific. And that creates lots of anxiety, lots of, you can say, concern in countries of the region, which are maybe smaller country or middle powers. I think smaller country, as per definition of Dr. Rafiq Dosani, they have limited influence and role. But even realism also, they talk about the big great powers, they decide international relations. But at least liberalism and constructivism, they feel that probably the role of middle powers are also important, the role of ideas, the role of institutions, and what could be the mechanism through which middle power they can articulate, you can say, their own response to this two, which are these two big narratives, two big trends which are happening in the Indo-Pacific region. I'll not take a long, you can say, time, and I think we have a very formidable expert on this topic, and I think he's going to enlighten us, tell us about this topic, and I think we are going to be quite you can say enlightened by his speech and his lecture. So I'll stop myself here, and now the floor to Dr. Rafiq Dosani.
Thank you, Professor Mishra. Sorry, I just came back from Indonesia this morning with a bad throat, so I hope you won't mind the occasional lozenge that I put in. So, yes, if you could put up the cover slide, and I'll just introduce the topic. My interest in it, along with those of my colleagues, this is a co-authored piece of work. Our interest in it was because when we started looking at what is the US position in what they call the Indo-Pacific, more particularly the near-term interest in Taiwan, protecting Taiwan, it seemed that the US would need to have allies if it was to make headway. At least it would need to have limited opposition to its any action that it might take should China attack Taiwan. So the natural thinking was, yes, of course, the allies of the US in the Asia-Pacific region, that is those that are located there, Australia, Japan, Korea, South Korea, as well as some that were outside the region but had a stake in the region. And there we're thinking of Canada and the United Kingdom, would be supporters of the US move because they are allies. But if you look closely at what ally means, there is a certain definition that that is defined, that that arises from the document that they have exchanged as allies. So if you look at the Korean situation, the US ROK alliance, Republic of Korea alliance, it very clearly limits the scope of the alliance to the affairs surrounding the Korean Peninsula. So technically, there's no obligation on the part of South Korea to support the US under that treaty if the US decides to invade, to counter the Chinese invasion and ask for Korea's help. Now, in practice, it might be very different, but certainly in many of these countries where domestic politics is very strong, you are going to see that there will be debate, there will be resistance. Similarly, you look at the Australia treaties with the US, ANZUS being the main one. It again defined the scope to the Pacific Islands and the area surrounding Australia and New Zealand. So from a strict definitional point of view, we could not then conclude that they're obliged to follow suit on the treaty if the US requests help. But in practice, we know that the US exercises much more power and has, for example, been able to get these countries, Japan, Korea, South Korea, Australia, to even undertake economic activities, sanctions, for example, on China, or electric vehicle restrictions and so on, which go well beyond the scope of the alliance as stated. So that was one reason to look at this very carefully. Second is, in studying middle powers historically, we found that the definition of middle powers, strangely enough, was changing with time. So this was a question for us, that why is it that there's not a steady definition of a middle power? So we wanted to understand that very carefully. For example, in the, if you look at the period from 1990, after the Cold War ended, when the US was really the only power that mattered in the world, you would see papers saying that, and these are by scholars like Jordan and, very important scholars in this field, saying that, we should define middle powers by what they do, not by any other criterion. So if what they do, if it's good for the world, then they are middle powers. If they build institutions and so on, if they support the liberal hegemonic order, then they are middle power. So that's clearly circular reasoning, because on one hand, you're saying you're a middle power if you do good, and then you say if you do good, you're a middle power. So one needed to clarify some of these issues. And in the process of doing that, we also built our own theory of what is a middle power and how it works, which is what I will spend a fair amount of time. And so the contents page that you can see here, we'll first talk about middle powers, why they are needed. Professor Mishra mentioned that they need for them. How do countries gain power? What is the status of traditional middle powers, by which I mean the UK and the Canadas of the world, and the emerging middle powers which are coming up, like Brazil, Turkey, India, and so on. India's interesting case. I'll come to it a little later. And then in the study that we did, I'll just give a few pieces of information that you might find interesting on assessments of China. And I think you'll find that it's, if you haven't read the paper, it's quite surprising and counterintuitive. And then I'll summarize with what we think are our key contributions. So next slide, please. So middle power is one that is neither great nor small. This is commonly used, but capable and willing. Both are important. Capable, it should have abilities, capacities, and should have the interest, willing to play significant roles that influence and shape what goes on in the world. I mean, India comes to mind immediately as a country that has long had capability, but really wasn't willing to play a significant role that influence and shape what goes on in the world. I think that's changed over the last couple of decades, and for interesting reasons, as we'll come to later. So why are middle powers needed? Well, if you look at the history, you see that they have played, these kinds of roles. One is the balance. So we know that power is unequally distributed across nations. Small and middle powers may lack the independence to resist great power initiatives to incorporate them in their world. So capable middle powers can protect small and middle powers through balancing partnerships. Historically, this was a very important role. And if you look at the late 1800s, you see, many wars that European countries were going through as they all became wealthier and wealthier on the back of colonization and in the Industrial Revolution, and they fought with each other. And then you had middle powers, which had enough power to change the balance of power. So Prussia could ally with Russia, go against it. So there were hundreds of these combinations that kept on taking place. And so middle powers were very important in that sense. And they also could protect each other, through these partnerships. So coalitions helped give them more power. Second, need is when there's, when you don't have institutions that can mediate great power disputes, as we saw what happened in world wars, then middle powers can help address this issue. And unfortunately, we are in that situation now again, where the United Nations and other large multilateral types of institutions have lost the power to mediate. Forget about great power, even small power disputes. And if middle powers were capable enough, they could address this issue. The third one is increase global security through public goods. The problem is that great powers tend to ignore win-win opportunity. For example, pandemic management, collaboration, climate change collaboration. And they've ignored it because they don't want to allow any soft power to be earned by the adversary. As long as the US was sort of the hegemon or the single superpower up to 2005-ish, before China appeared on the scene, it was very good. There were lots of associations being formed. We discuss it in our paper. Lots of win-win opportunities being taken advantage of. But then up comes China, and now the US is worried that anything it does in cooperation will reduce its reputational power, its soft power, which China will gather up. So it's reluctant to do that. So the middle powers usually in coalition can fill the gap in a less hurtful way for the great powers. So US and China might allow a middle power, and you've seen that in climate change. If you see how the role that Europe, although it doesn't like to think of itself as a middle power, even in all of Europe together, is essentially been playing that role in climate change. So in summary, for example, the landmark climate change accord was the 2015 Paris Agreement, which was brokered by the head of France at the time. So in summary, middle powers are needed mostly because of a gap in the middle. So that's the first point, which has two cases. And then the second point, which is mediation. The last case is one of helping all countries access public goods because of a gap created by rivalry. So in some ways, even the last case of public goods provision is sort of a middle power activity. If it's going to be that the great powers neglect win-win opportunities, public goods provision, then middle powers can fill the gap. Next slide, please. So to try and get some framework on this, and this has been a much debated subject, there's a taxonomy of power that we refer to, which is by Keohane in 1969. By the way, I'm happy to make this presentation available after it's done. I leave it to Alka and her colleagues to decide how to send it to you. So in this text, and the report underlying this, which is this one, it's gotten more. I left it in Mumbai for the last week or so when I was in Indonesia, and I find that's actually been affected quite a bit already by the humidity of Mumbai. So probably collapse another month. So there are four categories of middle power of power. First, there are system determining powers. These are states that play a critical role in shaping the international system, also called great power. The United States comes to mind. System influencing states do not dominate the international system, but may be able to influence it because of some exclusive capacity. Typically, they might think of United Kingdom, France, which have seats on the permanent membership of the Security Council. That gives it some capacity. It might be some that have some exclusive locational advantage. So those would be tier one middle power, and be interested in those that can influence global relationships, not that you have a small region like Kazakhstan in Central Asia. That would be more like a weaker category of middle power. So you have system affecting states do not dominate the system, but may be able to exercise influence over a limited number of states. So that's an example where Kazakhstan would fit in. That would be a tier two middle power. And finally, you have most of the countries which are small powers. They're system ineffectual states. They can do little to influence the system-wide forces that affect them, except in groups so large that each state has minimal influence. You see that in group of 77 and so on, the developing countries group. Next slide, please. So here, what was interesting is as we made this this table, So we said, okay, here are the system determining, system influencing, system affecting, and system ineffectual. That's the first or second row, the type of influence. And then if I look at, for example, of influence, I can see, impose global sanctions, effectively dominate a region, even though that's not quite there. I want, it should be dominate with some international influence coming out of it, manage a global peacekeeping operation. So I have some examples. And then we started thinking, well, where does China fit in and Russia fit in? They're clearly not great powers in the US sense of the word. They don't have anywhere near the same military, economic, or diplomatic capacity. And you can see that, I mean, neither China nor Russia has been able to really do anything about the war in Gaza, and China nothing in Ukraine either. So they're not great powers, but they have some disruptive capacity, at least as seen by, say, Europe. Russia certainly has a strong disruptive capacity. So, so an example of influence would be, as I mentioned, challenge to the US liberal international order in two key regions and in multilateral institutions. And one reason why the US has gone off the UN and other multilateral institutions, because China has a strong presence in them. And China has not hesitated to create its own competing institutions, the BRI initiatives, and so on. India is not at the major power level. Now, when I say disruptive, I don't mean in a bad sense. Change always happens through disruption. It might be in a good sense. I'm not making any value judgment here. I've used terms like liberal international order. They sound very good, but there are many countries that object to them. But India, in that sense, is clearly not. It's not a major power in the sense of being able to take any actions that disrupt the international order. And so we put it as sort of an emerging power, one that can influence the system, particularly in the Asia Pacific region. Next slide. So this then we suggest allows us to introduce a new category as in the second place. System disrupting states can disrupt the international system, but lack the power to shape it. And we'll come back to its usage later. Next slide. So here, just to get a sense of how is power gained? How do you get to influence international relations? So in the literature, we see three categories of, or three attributes of power. The first, which is very important, I mean, it's critical, is the ability to act independently of other actors on matters of foreign policy within the bounds of international law. That is the strategic autonomy of a country. Number two, the application of resources, assets, your wealth, your location, your skills, and so on. These are assets that you can then convert into power. So that is known as material power. And third, I gave the case of India changing its ambitions, although India always wanted to be a great power from time of Nehru. But, its actual motivation probably not as strong. It had bigger problems at home to look at. So motivation to achieve a desired status within the world, this is its ideology or its commitment. So these are the three attributes of power. Next slide. So this discusses how these three attributes then get converted to influence. So, we've used a standard sort of World Bankish input process. Sorry, I'll put this off. I apologize. Sorry, so we have assets. So we use the World Bank format of inputs, processes, outputs, and outcome. We didn't look at impact because that's a separate category. So in the assets list, which gives the material power, you have military assets, economic assets, proximity to the conflict, diplomatic skills. I think these are fairly straightforward. We can take them up later in questions. I think proximity to conflict may need some explanation. You can imagine that a Japan that is close to Taiwan would be more concerned in what the US does in response to a Chinese invasion of Taiwan than would a Canada, whose future is unlikely, whose existence is unlikely to be affected. Okay, and then these assets are filtered in a way through the country's norms and motivation. So norms are derived from values, belief in human rights, practice of domestic freedoms, um, and so these are the norms of the that the country practices domestically, and the question is how much are they applied to international relations of that country. And motivation is really driven by ambition. So these two together filter the use of the assets to create capabilities. The capabilities are the outputs, they're the extent of strategic autonomy, the material strength, and the ideology. And the application of these three outputs gives a country a certain level of influence, the outcomes. Next slide. So here, I just to make it more realistic, I spent some time here giving you some information from our study of China and middle powers concerns, and I'll come back to the theoretical part a little later. So here you see, we interviewed policymakers in 4 countries: Australia, Canada, Japan, and UK. So 4 middle powers interested in the Asia Pacific, 2 inside located, 2 located outside. Even though Canada keeps declaring that it is an Asia Pacific location as well, it isn't really. Its whole existence is on the other side of the country politically. But Australia, Japan certainly are there. So when we asked our respondents, what is the effect on China of a war with your country? The Australian respondents, you see the blue bar, that's how they responded. So the ranks went from 1 to 5. 3 was, somewhat important, but really not, unless it crosses 3, we're not going to take it as important. And above 3 would be, quite important, and 5 would be very important. And you can see that Japan and Australia both think that the effect on their country of a war with China would be significant. It's somewhat lower for Canada and the UK, but above 4 in all cases. Whereas if the effect on China of a war with the middle power, China is not going to be affected, according to them, by and large. I mean, Japan is the only one which you can say a little more thinks that it could affect China. And generally, respondents from other countries also agreed with that. But even then, they thought the effect on them would be far higher. And, you can see it's the highest orange bar is on that, on Japan. Next slide. So now I'll just quickly, you might find this interesting, Australia's view of itself. This was very relevant in building our theory, because what we saw is that middle powers are, these traditional middle powers are taking a very different view of themselves than you'd really think of it from outside. So Australia's views, so these are from respondents in Australia. One is that Australia has allowed its military and diplomatic capacities to wither since 2010 in order to increase resources for maintaining economic growth. Their economic leverage over China is limited to coal and iron ore exports. And one person I asked him, what about Australian technology? It's quite sophisticated in many areas. He said, no, we have no leverage over China on that. We just, our only relationship with China, that we dig up bits of Australia and export them to China. And assuming the US responds militarily, Australia would support the US effort with diplomacy, supply, and logistics, but would not directly act. It believes that South Korea, Japan, New Zealand are likely to be the only other response and will behave similarly. And you might be interested in the aside on India, that India too, they believe, will not respond to a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, as it would not suddenly regard China as a threat to its interests if there was a Taiwan Strait contingency. Next slide. Coming to Canada's view, somewhat similar to Australia, Canada's military and diplomatic capacity has been falling since the 1960s, so even further back, has no economic or political leverage over China, will not join a US-led coalition with troops largely driven by lack of capacity, and China doesn't care about Canada. As one respondent put it, Xi Jinping doesn't wake up every morning asking for a quick briefing on the status of Canada. Next slide. What about Japan? So of the 4 countries, interestingly, Japan believes that it is the weakest in its ability to resist US pressure to join a response. Japanese citizens, however, do not think Japan should fight China. They were saying that even if China were to attack Japan, China will say to Japan that if it joins the military action, it will take military action against Japan as well. This will be a very difficult decision for Japan, as it will be sandwiched between the US and China. But China, interestingly, does not see value in relationship building with Japan. It sees Japan in two ways: a place to acquire technology and as a US satellite. If a war with Taiwan occurs, the breakdown in economic relations with Japan is a given. So there's no need for China to build strong relations with Japan. And this view of China is very interesting. If you live in the US, you're constantly bombarded by, papers written by respected academics, policymakers on the China threat. Let's see what these countries, which are close allies of the US, say. I'll give you some more information on that in a moment. Ultimately, Japanese respondents believe that Japan would not send troops to battle or even send its navy to remove a Chinese blockade of Taiwan. As one said, Japan is not ready to fight and die for the defense of Taiwan. Next slide. Finally, the UK. UK will be supportive only diplomatically. It is too weak to intervene militarily. So with this statement, you can see that 3 out of the 4 countries, excluding Japan, all think that they're too weak really to get involved. China-Taiwan relations are low priority for the UK. The question, again, a quote, the question of whether the United Kingdom should defend Taiwan militarily is for the Prime Minister not nearly as important as the National Health Service or the economy or unemployment. International relations do not come high on his agenda. If they do, the main focus is Europe and Russia. And finally, the UK action would have no effect on China's behavior. We already saw that in the graph. As one said, we're such a small player that China wouldn't consider this an issue. If the UK was to stop doing business with China, it's not going to have a huge impact on China. They will just shrug their shoulders and carry on. Next slide. So from this, we sort of piece together China's view of the world as seen by these 4 countries. And this is what comes out, that China's overarching goal is to ensure the permanent primacy of the Communist Party within China, which I think is a commonly accepted view generally. But this is interesting, it's neither hegemonistic nor multilateralist. China wants to be, and the reasons are given here. China wants to be the strongest power in Southeast Asia, but is uninterested in the hegemonic aspect of it, getting involved in their affairs, because it doesn't really fit into its main goal, which is the primacy of the CCP within China. So it stays out of affairs that do not directly concern China. It is not predisposed to war. As one said, China is not all about being a hegemon itself. It just doesn't want the US to be the hegemon. So it's quite comfortable with the multipolar, multilateral order, because it knows in that sort of order, it's going to carry a lot of weight simply because of its size. And even with America, Beijing probably thinks that if America doesn't like us, honestly, it's no big deal as long as they don't start shooting us over Taiwan. China says it favors multilateralism, but in practice, it uses multilateralism as an instrument to exclude the US, not a principle. For example, China will not discuss the South China Sea issue at the ASEAN Regional Forum. They'll only negotiate directly with Vietnam or the Philippines. Also, China thinks Southeast Asia is weak and fragmented, and they can do what they want there. And they might be right. And I thought this last quote, which was quite a well-known quote of Yang Jiechi at the Shangri-La Dialogue, I think somewhere in the 1990s, had said, China is a big country and other countries are small countries, and that's just a fact. So that gives you a sense of the views of these countries, and you can see that they're quite unusual views. Next slide, please. And in fact, these views have, when this paper report was published about a month ago, there's been quite some interest in the basis for these views, by media, policymakers in the US, and also in these countries. Okay, so now coming back to the theory. So by the mid-1990s, if you look at phases, so you had a period when you had the Cold War, then you had this unipolar period from 1990 to 2005, roughly. Then you had China as a major or a great power coming back. So by the mid-1990s, when middle powers, which were these traditional middle powers like Britain and France, they started cutting back their budgets for defense and diplomacy, thinking that why do we need to waste 2-3% of our GDP on these two things when the US is there. It's there for us. It's a superpower, so they started cutting back their budgets. Now, under a lot of US pressure and, of course, the Ukraine experience, this is slowly changing back, but it will take time. But as of now, the traditional middle power, the type that we interviewed, is too weak to be a balancing power between great powers. It's so weak that it cannot even mediate at any power level. Forget about great powers. And the other reason that they can't mediate even at the sub-great power level is that as part of the geopolitical rivalry, China and the US are trying to grab whatever space they can, political space they can. Then, they don't want anyone else there. They don't trust them fully. And also, to mediate between China and the US is a matter of trust. If these are allied with the US, China would not trust it. Third, they are unable to deliver public goods. That space is part of geopolitical rivalry. Their only role is to coalesce with other allied middle powers in support of their patrons' goals, the US in this case. So, from our point of view, these are not really middle powers. Yeah? They don't fulfill it. The first three are the conditions they must fulfill, at least one of, to be classed as a middle power. If their only role is to support their patrons' goal, whether to build up a mini-lateral or something else, that to us is not a middle power. It's just, you can say, a small power or a capable country, but not a middle power. It's not in the middle of anything. It's firmly on one side. Next slide. But what we are seeing is, interestingly, the evolution of independent middle powers. Now, of course, it's an old concept. When we talked of balancing powers, they were independent and they were very important then. But during the Cold War, that didn't really last. Various groupings tried to behave independently, but were subverted. And so the NAM, the non-aligned movement, largely did nothing. I'm sure that's a controversial conclusion, but broadly, that's my view. And during the period of US hegemony, which was, after the Cold War, the US viewed large emerging economies as useful extensions of US economic power. So it was really economically driven that US encouraged various countries to become regionally strong. China to build supply chains in Asia, India to be a software developer, Turkey as a manufacturer in the Caucasus, Kazakhstan, Central Asia, etc. So as a result, some strong regional economies had grown by 2001. But then we know what happened. China's massive growth spurt between 2000 and 2010. This assumption that you'd have these friendly and even China was a middle power till then. This assumption came undone and the US shifted to diplomatic and military means to manage China. One strategy was to encourage friendly regional powers to add diplomatic and military clout to the economic clout. In other words, to become hegemons in the region, but within limits imposed by the US. Whether it will work is yet to be seen. Most of the friendly powers, India being an example, favor multipolarity and multilateralism, which is against what the US wants. Yet the attraction of a rapid increase in power due to US patronage is very strong. So I think this is an example of India again becomes a good example. Next slide. So now I'm wrapping up here. So to summarize sort of, when you had the roles of middle powers have evolved, and in the 19th century it was largely seen as a balancing and mediating power. By the start of World War II, 7 great powers controlled 90% of the world's territory. There were no middle powers. Then comes the Cold War, the UN is formed, and then Britain and France and so on find that really they have no role in the UN, even though it was designed to give them a permanent role. And that, so USSR and US are even willing to collaborate to kick them out of the colonial power in many countries. So then the middle powers like Canada and so on, which had some economic capacity, they said, well, what we will do is, support the building of liberal institutions, public goods provision, peacekeeping, climate change support. And that really explains why Europe has been so ahead of the game in climate change. Then you had, of course, the hegemony period. We've already discussed that. And in the present time, you have the emergence of independent regional hegemons. Next slide. So just a quick note, today, if you look at Asia's middle powers, so you have, I took those which were in the top 30 in the US News and World Report that were from Asia or interested in Asia. So you have these countries listed, 8 of them. Of them, 5 are allied middle powers. 3 are independent. I take independent to be those that have shown by their actions that they can play a role for the US and for China. India, because of the Chinese incursion, is not equidistant from both countries. So it's now, if you look at what they can do, the long-term, mediating power, maybe Singapore, maybe Vietnam, public goods providers, which require a lot of capacity, certainly the allied powers have it. A balancing power, really, India is the only one that I think could play that role, but not yet. It's neither has the power nor the willingness to be an equidistant player. Next slide. Okay, so just to wrap up, this is the last slide. So what we, I think this paper from our point of view was allowed us to sort of bring major powers into the taxonomy, showed how assets get translated to influence using our logic model. And third, that the definitions of middle powers, which have kept changing over time, and the most recent definitions of traditional and emerging, even that is not appropriate. That really what counts are independent middle powers and allied middle powers, the first being in a category which is likely to grow with time, and the allied middle powers will be restricted to certain roles to promote the interests of their allied power, great power. Okay, thank you. Next slide. I think that's it. Right. Thanks. Over to you, over to the organizers.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for giving a very extensive, actually, explanation about middle powers, because this is a concept which is quite, you can say, people are quite confused about what middle powers are. And you tried with all details and clarity that I think there could be major power, there could be, it's a great power, major power, middle power, tier 1, middle power, tier 2, and you can say small powers. And you try to give a very comprehensive picture to understand how they play their role in international relations. So it's a very interesting presentation. I learned a lot. And I think I will ask people who are listening to your lecture that they should write their questions or their comments to chat box, or if they want, they can raise their hand and we can take up those questions, those comments, and listen Dr. Rafiq Dosani's response. Meanwhile, I will begin with a few of my small observations. I think I really appreciate the way you try to delineate this idea about middle powers. And it's really hard work and lots of, you can say, thoughts have been gone into it. And what kind of responses they are going to have. Especially, I think you have basically picked up a cross-strait relationship. And in that, if there are some emergencies, how they are going to take up their roles and what kind of responses they are going to have. But one thing I would like to say that I think you have tried to broaden it, but it seems to me that inherently, I think in your presentation, I found that probably there's a bias towards saying that all the middle powers, or rather majority of middle powers, they are having, you can say, equally, or maybe they are having discomfort with China's rise. Actually, there have been other scholars who have been arguing that, especially in Southeast Asia, if I can say, there are countries which are having different response towards China's rise. So I think if they have to decide, there's a, the US-China rivalry in Indo-Pacific is a very, very important trend. But middle powers and even small powers, they are not very certain about their positions. And their positions are going to be determined by the future course of this rivalry. So I think necessarily they are going to go away from China. I think I'm not very sure. So that's one point I would like to say, that it seems to me that your lecture is located in maybe American, you can say articulation of this topic. So if you want to tell us more about something this. The second point which I wanted to highlight, that largely you talked about, like, suppose four countries you have decided: Canada, UK, Australia, and I think uh, Japan. I think two of the country, they are not part of Indo-Pacific area. So in a way, regionally they are outsiders. So why not take talk more about Indonesia? In case Indonesia is, you don't consider a middle power, maybe ASEAN as a whole, though they are having different perspectives. Because ASEAN countries, they don't have a common, clear, they do have a ASEAN outlook about Indo-Pacific, but I think still there are lots of differences. So why not more about regional country, how they have been looking at this thing? The third point, which is also related, that in my opinion, I have seen that uh, 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 I think including India, if I talk to many people, it's not, you can say, because at this point of time, say India's growth rate is say 7-8% per annum. There are other countries in ASEAN countries also, they want that status quo stability must continue. The rivalry between US and China must be at least, you can say somehow it could be mellowed down for time being at least, so that our growth, our future prospects are. So they have been also talking about what is called third wave, rather than going with any of these two big narratives, two big trends. They have been talking about third wave. And what is the prospect of third wave? I think that would also, I would like to hear from you. And I think um, I think I'll stop myself here, and you can respond to that, and then I will open the floor for other questions.
Sure, thank you. No, these are good, very useful. So on your first question about, that my analysis is rooted with an American perception, it's interesting you say that, because those in America who read it say you've got a third world perception. And I mean, for example, I talk about America being a hegemon. I'm not saying I necessarily approve of the liberal international order. I'm not saying disruptive powers that are necessarily doing a bad thing. So, in that sense, I think our approach was to be objective. The only problem I think that came out was that for our study, we used powers that are closely allied with the United States. I mean, both are negative, because good to get countries like India, Indonesia, Vietnam, views which would be somewhat more balanced. But as you saw, even for those allied countries, they're not, they don't think China will go to war. I mean, it's completely different from the US view. So we present that view quite faithfully. I think the four independent, four middle powers, even though they're allied, they give views that are very different from American foreign policy. But still, I accept your comment, and welcome any examples of what I said that might bring out a different point of view that I might have stated. So that's one. So your second question is, why not look at countries like Indonesia or ASEAN as a region? Yeah, absolutely. I think I would like to do that. India, Indonesia, Vietnam, for sure. Maybe Philippines as well. Maybe Malaysia as well. Looking at I mean, I have two orders of business to carry forward this project. That's one, to try and make it more balanced with including those. And second is really, I think what this project showed is such a dissonance between American views and their closest allies' views on what is China's goal, how is it going about achieving it, approach to multilateralism, approach to hegemony, and why it is that way. That difference is very interesting, because if America goes in with the wrong assumptions to attack or counterattack, it would find itself in a deep problem if none of these countries joined it. So from an American, so there I take an American point of view, saying they need to resolve the difference. And what I'm working towards is a track 1.5 dialogue between these four middle powers and the US to try and see what are their sources of difference and whether they can be ironed out. And then your third point was, of course, that these differences will come up because for most of these countries, they look on the economic growth as the basis for their future survival, prosperity, and so on. They're not interested in the geopolitics. I couldn't agree more. I think if it wasn't for the US's immense power, to the extent that it can even change China's standing in, as you pointed out, as major exporter to so many countries, and to impose through financial control, SWIFT and so on, a regime of sanctions on China and other countries. The world would not go for it. I mean, if financial sanctions did not apply, the US would have failed, but they do. They are effective because I mean, the fact is even China has obeyed the sanctions imposed on Russia by the US. The sanctions themselves are sort of an illegal form of activity because it's not UN sanctioned. So yes, so I couldn't agree more on interest in growth, and I think countries, in India included, would much rather not have a war, not have geopolitics interfere with their lives, but it's a reality, and I think India is trying to use it to its advantage.
Yeah, thank you. We have a question in chat box from
Yes.
Mr. Sutino, and basically he's asking that as you, in your presentation, you mentioned that ideology is a very important part of any power, including the middle powers. And he said that in many of this reason, actually many countries, the right-wing ideology has been getting more and more, you can say, powerful. So what is going to, how it's going to be affecting the future geopolitical rivalry, this right-wing ideology prominence in the middle powers of this region?
Yeah, no, good, very good question. So as far as the US is concerned, I think the right wing's ascendance is in a way counterintuitive. I mean, I think it'll actually reduce America's interest in what happens to China, as long as China doesn't become more powerful, too much more powerful. They're more isolationist. I mean, if you look at the Trump approach to being a great power, it's sort of like China's view, leave me alone, just recognize I'm a great power, don't mess with me, I've got the strength to respond back. I think the worry is that as the Canadian, UK, maybe UK, but maybe not now, but Canadian, Japan and Australia have moved sharply right over the last couple of decades, you can clearly see the effect on their foreign policy. I mean, Stephen Harper ended all Canada's sort of softer approaches to China and took a hardline view. Albanese, who is a Democrat, has done that. I think that's it's sort of disconcerting to see that even in America, whether it's Democrat or Republican, when it comes to China, there's the countries are hyper competitive against China. So I mean, Biden has put in place alliances that Trump would not have done, but have made the US very powerful as a result. And similarly, you see that Australia and Canada doing the same. Hopefully, the UK will be more balanced. Japan, of course, has been moving right for some time. But even though it's moving sharply to the right, I still think it's in my view is that it's still a pacifist state overall, and all the public opinion polls support that conclusion.
I think there is another question by Mr. Nurag Khan, and he's asking that he would like to disagree with the Australian view that the Taiwan Strait contingency will be viewed as in India's interest, as former Ambassador Vijay Gokhale had pointed out. the annexation of Taiwan would free the plan to further its outreach in the Indian Ocean and hence engage India in a double trap on the Himalaya through the PLA and on the Indian Ocean through the plan, with the possible help from Sri Lanka and Maldives. Like Australia, India would allow its port and bases to be used by US Navy for maintenance and repair facilities. Further, the importance of Taiwan for India was highlighted in the recent war games held between Indo-Taiwanese think tanks. Your thoughts, sir? Basically, what he's saying that in Taiwan contingency, probably you indicated in your lecture that India and Australia would be slightly reluctant to participate with the United States and feel that much because basically it will because once Taiwan is basically taken up by China, I think the next target would be India and Australia, given the capacity and increase, you can say, reach of China. So he's saying that that has been emphasized in recently Indo-Taiwanese some think tank negotiations, think tank talks. So what is your opinion about that?
No, thank you. That's a great question. So if you look at the Ukraine war, there's some learning there that once countries in Asia Pacific, which reacted with alarm initially, when they saw that it's not really going to affect their economies, they just backed off and lost interest. If there's actually active disinterest in the Ukraine war in Asia, possible exception of Japan being pushed by the US to be a little more activist on that. So the lesson one should take away, I think, from that is if you view it as an existential threat over some time period that you decide is important to you, then you take action. Now, India's case is interesting because it's rapidly increasing its capabilities, both economic and military, and also diplomatically. So I think it views this time as a window where it needs sort of an undisturbed period to ascend, and that's why the Chinese incursion was so disturbing to India. But it's sort of managed that. It's managed to leverage that to get closer to the US, to get a lot of support from the US economically, militarily, and so on. And if China attacks Taiwan, either invasion, blockade, or whatever, I think India would say, on a 10-year view, is that going to affect me? And I think they would take the view that it would not. Whereas if they responded, they would know that immediately there's a negative effect. China would not hesitate to attack India. So different from Gokhale's view.
And actually some because I wanted to make some can say supplementary inquiry. Let's say because you are doing a very comprehensive research about responses or other possible responses of all these countries, how much you have been taking up this factor that in several countries, suppose South Korea present government Yoon Suk Yeol, they have a different disposition for United States and China, and the previous president Moon Jae-in, he had quite opposite can say opinion about China and United States rivalry. So because I think in democratic country, there have been lots of, we can say, churning in domestic politics and how they are going to affect, because they may have a very, you can say drastically different approach given the person and political party which is in power in these countries. So have you factored in this kind of, you can say, scenario or say, change of variables?
Yeah, I think that's really important because these are democracies where change happens regularly. So the best that the US and China can do is during the period that they have a friendly administration in those countries, they should make long-term investments, what US is now busy doing in the Philippines. It's trying to do that in Korea as well. It's harder there because Korea is in some ways a much more active democracy. Its local public is very, the public of Korea is very important in determining all kinds of outcomes. The opposition did very well in the recent assembly elections. So Korea is somewhat different from the Philippines, but I think the basic message is the same. And I must say, China is hampered by one factor. It doesn't really have an ideology to sell. Although it declares non-interference and non-intervention, that's not an ideology. It's not offering a positive way of democracy and so on. And, frankly, I don't think the Chinese like their own ideology about Communist Party, but it's there and they're living with it. So, but that said, I think I do agree that there is, it's really important to keep in mind this fluctuation that takes place, and that there will be time. I mean, you see it in Sri Lanka, you see it in Maldives. I mean, almost every country which actually has a fair vote, there will be change. And so both countries have to live with that, the US and China.
So any other question? Any comment? Yeah, Vikas, you want to ask question?
No, Professor. I was just saying that in the chat box there are no questions posted, and even on YouTube also, so there are no questions. So
Okay, okay. So I have one last question, and then probably we can conclude. Uh, I'm also interested in actually in last 2-3 years. If you look at the geopolitical rivalry in Indo-Pacific, and I have seen that there was a time when lots of people they were talking about Quad and China competing with each other. Then there was a time when they started talking about Quad plus. And then I think in last 3-4 years, I think almost every important player in this region, they have been talking about ASEAN centrality. So ASEAN centrality, because when we are saying ASEAN centrality, basically we are talking about a regional group, and that model is going to be quite central. So your research about middle power in geopolitical rivalry and so-called ASEAN centrality or ASEAN way to deal with this rivalry. Do you have any overlapping or say any contradiction in these two approaches? Because recently our foreign minister Jaishankar also was in a meeting in ASEAN, and I think like East Asia Summit was there, and I think other countries also they participated, and there also they kept emphasizing about ASEAN centrality, ASEAN centrality. So this middle power response and a response through ASEAN centrality, do they overlap and do they contradict, and how they basically go along with each other?
So I think the reality is there in every statement of the Quad, for example, that I've read, even the latest one yesterday. So, we emphasize the centrality of ASEAN. I mean, if you look at Quad, it's kind of a failure so far, in my opinion, because all it does is say we're offering public goods, vaccination support, disaster relief. That's not needed, I mean, you have the World Health Organization to do health. You have, various UN agencies dealing with disaster relief. So they're offering something that it'd be better off if they gave the money to the appropriate UN agency and they could spend it more effectively. So it's just biding time till, in my opinion, till the time that India is ready to be a little more forthcoming in its statements about China. And then it'll start talking about China. Right now, China doesn't even make any news in those things. So therefore, we have to ask, what is the ASEAN centrality that the US and its allies think of? And is that what ASEAN thinks of it? And is that what other countries not in the US alliance think of the ASEAN way, or ASEAN centrality? I think from ASEAN's point of view, they think they are central to what happens in the Asia-Pacific region, but they don't want anyone else coming in and interfering with that, and they want to decide their own future. Whether they fail, as in the case of Myanmar, or whether they succeed, as many of the border disputes that they've sorted out over the years. So I think that's the ASEAN thinking. But so then I think the US approach is ASEAN ought to be a natural partner of the US because China is encroaching on ASEAN, right? It can treat countries like Cambodia as its own. It's gotten so deeply in, and these are not good for those countries that they then become undemocratic. Clearly, that's not the view within ASEAN, nor is it the view of independent countries. And India will take the view that ASEAN has full right to choose its foreign policy. So there, I think, the complete difference in what is the ASEAN way of doing things in coordination, collaboration, partnership, very different views of these things.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think we have two additional questions from Mr. Anurag Khond and Mr. Sutino. And I think they are asking, let's say, Mr. Anurag is asking that you can say, ambition of middle power and great powers, they clash. Like, for example, he's saying that in case of South Korea, they talk about global pivotal state. And I think America, they have their own vision for the. So do they clash? And Sutino actually is talking about I think again like say China in South China Sea, how they have been trying to settle or not settle disputes with ASEAN country. So your quick comment on these two questions.
Yeah, thank you. So on the first one about whether the ambitions of countries like South Korea, which have all declared they are middle powers, to how that maps with what the US wants through their alliance. I think South Korea will work closely within the limits set by the US, especially under this present government. If you look at history, Japan learned its lesson in the 1980s when it tried to become somewhat independent of the US, not militarily, but economically and diplomatically, went about with a very large, world's largest soft aid program. Then it tried to set up the ASEAN Asian Development Bank in 1979 or something like that. And all these initiatives the US was upset about, and finally in 1987 the Plaza Accord sealed it for Japan, went on a 30-year decline. So I think Korea would have studied the history, even though it doesn't much care for Japan, and it cares for history. It would see that there's no point overstepping the limits. When you're in an alliance, that's what the problem is. It's your US becomes your best friend and your enemy as well. If you look at Professor Sutino's question, that China looks at multilateralism for growth. Why does China not believe in multilateralism when China is its neighbor, right? So why does China downplay multilateralism? The answer in our analysis is that China is really only interested in one thing, which is the primacy and long-term of the Chinese Communist Party, which means a certain level of legitimacy domestically of the Communist Party, which means in turn that everything else is subsidiary to that. So multilateralism, the question they ask is, how does that help us? It only helps China, they think, if it keeps the US out. So they like multilateralism, but when you see how they practice it, they don't practice it well, When I read out Yang Jiechi's comment where he said, he's telling an audience, the Shangri-La Dialogue, which has all the ASEAN countries, China's a big country, you guys are a small country, and that's a fact. So you couldn't be more dismissive than that. So I think the reason why China is not more multilateralist is because it's following a different objective. Right?
So thank you very much, Dr. Rafiq Dosani. I think it's a very complicated topic which you covered, and there are lots of confusion, I think, among scholars, among policymakers. You have taken a formidable task to try to arrange that properly, so can we make some sense of this, lots of happening around this region and all these issues. It's a work in progress. There could be many scholars, many students, researchers participating in this conference. They may agree or disagree on certain points, but everybody will definitely accept that that you have been trying to make this difficult scenario comprehensible. So thank you very much for your presentation and lecture. We all learned a lot, and now up to Vikas Thakur for closing remarks.
Thank you, Professor Misra. I seek your permission to formally bring an end to today's session.
Yeah, thank you.
With this, we come to an end to today's seminar.
Vikas, we can give 30 seconds to Dr. Rafiq Dosani. Any last words you want to say?
I just wanted to convey my thanks. It was a very thoughtful moderation, Professor Mishra. I think you patiently let all the issues come up and ask the questions really well. So it was a very great learning experience for me. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Vikas.
With this, we come to into the today's seminar. We thank Professor Rafiq Dosani and Professor Sandeep Kumar Misra for gracing today's seminar with their presence and for giving us their precious time. We also offer our gratitude to the audience. The video of today's seminar shall be available on ICS's YouTube channel. We extend a warm invitation to all for the upcoming Wednesday seminar scheduled for 7 August 2024 at 3 p.m. IST. The title of the seminar is Tibet, the Never India Lost. Details about the event can be found on ICS website, or you can subscribe to our newsletter for regular updates. Thank you everyone for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. Thank you.